Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I thought I'd do a little tutorial on how I make brushes in Photoshop. I really love doing this. It's great fun because you can try out different textures and things like that, and you can also really add like a distinctive touch to your own work, and it's quite fun as well to have work where you know you've made your own brushes. So I thought I'd show you how I do it, and you can have a go if you want to. So the first thing I do is just pick any brush, either one that I've already made or one of the general Photoshop brushes, and I need to make a brush shape. So I have a white background, create a new layer, and it really depends what type of brush you want to make, but for the sake of example I'm just going to make a really textured brush. Sometimes I have a really specific idea what I want to create, and sometimes it's good to just kind of explore a bit and see what happens. So we'll do the latter approach for this one. So let's get it to about 100% just so I can see the shape I've got, and I want something that's kind of going to be quite textured and have a few different marks. So I'll show you how I go about that. Actually, I might just zoom out a little bit. You have to bear in mind that even if you've got lots of different marks, if you have something like that, it's still going to provide quite a solid stroke because there's a line that's going to be carrying through. So sometimes you get an idea what something will look like before you've made it. It is you never quite know, so it's always great fun to explore. Okay, yeah, that looks quite fun. Let's have a go with that. So what I do next, make sure you've got a white background selected, and it will only pick up the black areas. And you're going to edit, and I can't find it myself now, define brush preset, and give it a name, and that will give the shape that you've created a name. So in this, for the sake of example here, let's call it, have a fun name. What's a fun name? Texture crunch. Let's say that, texture crunch. It's not the most inventive thing. There we go, and so it's immediately come up with what I've just created. Now what I'm going to do, and I'll show you why in a moment, is I'm going to create another shape as well before I actually make my brush. So we'll go back, there we go, and this time I'll do a slightly different shape. Let's do that. It's a bit weird, but so again, edit, define, brush preset. And we'll call this texture crunch 2. My inventiveness is off the scale at the moment, but also it helps me to find them together. So texture crunch, so you can see at the bottom of my brushes here, I have these two new brushes. In fact, let's do that. So go to texture crunch 1 first. Now what I'm going to do, I've created an action that gives me a midtone. I love to work on something that's not pure white, so it just makes it easier on the eyes. And also you can get a feel for how highlights and shadows will look as well as you're testing the brush out. Okay, so this is the first brush we've made. Now the brush size, let's say 125, that's actually quite a large size, although it looks small on this canvas. I always zoom into 100% here, so I just get a feel for how the brush is look at, oh, I've gone back to the wrong brush. Right, there we go. So that, without any settings, that's how the brush looks at the moment. Now I tend to use kind of some kind of just slightly lighter blue to test the brush, because it just shows things like if there's any hue jitter and things like that, which I'll come to. So in the brush settings, this is where we get to really play and develop the brush. So in the brush tip shape, the spacing, that's kind of, so if you think of the brush like a stamp, the spacing is how close the stamps would be together. So the lower the spacing, the more solid the stroke. So that's a fairly solid stroke. If I widen the spacing, you can see it's a lot wider. Okay, so shape dynamics is one that I tend to use. You can have the shape size, so you can start with a smaller size. So pen pressure, the harder you press, the bigger the size will be. And then again with roundness, that means that the actual shape of the brush will change as well depending how hard you press. So immediately you have some pressure sensitive control, which is under shape dynamics. Sometimes I'll put on angle jitter as well, which makes your stroke slightly wobbly, but for the moment we'll leave that off. One of my favourite things is colour dynamics, and the reason being is it sort of emulates traditional media. So if you're painting, you'll have, it's never a perfect solid colour like it is digitally. There's always a slight jitter, I suppose, or kind of mixing of hues. So there we go, you can see it gives that kind of, what it does is it takes the hue that you're using and just, the wider the jitter, it will just use different hues around that within the stroke. Okay, I'm going to turn brush transfer on, so that means that again our pen pressure now, the harder we press the darker it comes. So we've got pen pressure for opacity and for flow. So opacity is how solid the colour is, flow is kind of hard to explain. It's sort of how much the stroke will release some of the colour. So if the flow is at full, it will be a lot more opaque. Then the lower it is, the more control you have, or the more variance, perhaps I should say. And build up allows you to build up the strokes. So that's our basic brush at the moment. The other thing I'm just going to change in the shape dynamics as a control, which I love to play with. There's normally three settings. I either have it off or with pen tilt, so that as you tilt the pen, it goes with the angle that it's tilted at. Well, the one I tend to use the most often is direction, so it chooses the direction of the stroke and keeps it fairly uniform. So for now, I'm going to try that. Now, one of the other things you can do is you can apply a texture if you've got a texture ready-made. I'll show for example, but I'm not going to do it for this brush. When you apply a texture to a brush, it saves the texture as part of the brush, so it takes a lot more file size to do it. So let's take a texture I've already made, so I can just show you. Tim coloured pencil brush pattern, let's use that. And you have a lot of controls for that. The depth is the main one I tend to use. You can choose the scale of it. So the scale, if it was 100%, that's the original texture size, and so you can have all sorts of different effects with the texture, like so. So this one was designed to for another brush where I was emulating a coloured pencil on textured paper. You can see that the texture repeats a bit there because it's quite a small texture. So that's one thing you can try and play around with. and I do love doing that, and I've got a lot of texture brushes, but my favourite thing is something called dual brush, which is just below the texture. And what you can do is you can combine two brush heads together. So as we've just made this brush and this brush, which are Texture Crunch 1 and 2, you can actually combine brush heads so that they interact with each other and give you a sort of a random stroke. So when you have a texture, it can look random, but it's a uniform pattern, almost as if you're, so let me show you again. So if I have the texture quite small, and zoom out, sometimes you can see where the texture repeats. Let's just make it smaller. There, so you can see sort of lines in the texture just where it's repeating itself. Whereas with the dual brush, it's actually random, and I'll show you how that works. If I take my brush size down again, so it's without the texture, just as the brush at the moment. And now this is the bit I've never found a shortcut for, is finding the brush I've just made. So I want Texture Crunch 2. Let's have a look at the shape of it again to remind myself. There, so it's like a wobbly shape. And I'm looking for that shape in here. Okay, so here we go, Texture Crunch 2, and that's my second brush, which sort of acts underneath this one, and the two brush heads sort of mask each other off and combine. I'm probably not explaining it very well, but they interact with each other, and you can try lots of different brushes with each other. So you can see as I increase the spacing, it gives the brush stroke a more broken look. I love to have scattering, so I choose both axes so it's doing top and bottom, and add some scattering in. So you can see now that I'm getting a sort of stroke, but the difference between this and texture is if I do it twice, or do it in the same place, it's random, so even though I'm drawing in the same place, it's coming out differently. So you can, the count means how many times it does it. So if it's a very broken texture, increasing the count will make it more opaque, or less gaps in the texture. So I think of it this way, all these controls on the left control the main brush that I'm using, and in dual brush these controls here control the second brush. So you can play around with the way that the two interact with each other. Like so. I'm going to add some scattering on the main brush. So just like we've got on the second brush, I'll have a little scattering on the main one, and I'll apply it via pen pressure, so how hard I press depends how much it applies the scattering, like so. The count jitter just means that normally it's set at 2, but it just randomly makes it more or less applied. That again can be applied by pen pressure. So the harder I press, the more it jitters the count. So you can see immediately we've got a sort of a texture brush that's not going to take a lot of file size because there's no texture embedded, but using the two brush shapes that we created, we get quite an interesting texture, and that's the sort of thing that you can do to kind of just add a bit of variety to your work, and you know that if you lay the same stroke down twice, it's going to look different, which gives you more of a kind of a traditional media look, I suppose, or something a little less digital. I'm just going to, now I've done that, I'm just going to add a little more hue jitter. Like so. Let's just, sometimes it's always good to just test how the darks and the lights look with a brush. Get a feel. Yeah, I think I quite like that. So there you go, that's how I make brushes. I might make some more brush tutorials if you're interested. But yeah, just for those interested, I thought it might be fun to have a look. And most importantly, have a go yourself. Make some brushes and send them my way as well. I'd love to see what you do with them. Alright, take care. Hello again, just a little addendum. I suddenly realised that the most important thing to tell you how to do, because computer programs do crash sometimes, is how to save your brush. So I've created this brush, which is here, but at the moment if I don't do anything, it just defaults to what it was before. So as soon as I've got a brush that I'm happy with, like so, I go into new brush preset. Let's call it Tim Texture Crunch 1 and click on OK. And now I have my new brush, but what I want to do to make sure that it's saved and backed up is you go into Export Selected Brushes, and then you can choose a file location on your computer where to save your brush. That's the most important step, because the amount of times I've made a brush and then close Photoshop or it's crashed and I've lost the brush, I cannot tell you. So new brush preset, make your brush, name it, and then once you've done that, go into Export and you've got it saved in your library. Take care.